All right, everyone, hello. This is Elena Zuyak from Mirrix Looms, and welcome to our bead weaving crash course webinar. Thank you so much for spending your Saturday afternoon with us. And I hope this next hour is really useful to you and helpful. We're going to kind of go over some things starting from the basics, like who Mirrix is, why choose a Mirrix loom, a little bit on warping, a little bit on weaving, some accessories, and then we're going to go into some more details and look at some questions that you guys asked us. So let's get started. So again, thank you for joining. I went over this a little bit already, but we're going to cover why you should choose a Mirrix for weaving beads, warping and weaving in different ways. We're going to talk about warping and weaving without the shutting device, with the shutting device, which is a thing that a lot of you expressed interest in learning more about. And we're also going to talk about the no warp ends kit. Which if you don't know what it is, you will learn very soon. We're going to talk about our best accessories for bead weaving. We'll briefly talk about combining beads and fiber. And then the last part, we're going to really get into some more details and answer some participant questions. Now, we asked all of you to ask a question when you signed up for the webinar, and we had a couple hundred questions, so not every question is going to be answered. What we tried to do was to look at the most common themes and the most common questions and group those together. Some of you with more specific questions, we actually just emailed back and answered. If we didn't answer your question, and if we don't answer it or a question similar to it in the webinar, let me know. You can always email me, elena@merrixlooms.com, if you have a clarification or if you have a question that we didn't get to. But we tried to answer the questions that we think will help the most people. And if you think of any questions during the webinar or after the webinar, again, email me and we will get back to you as soon as we can. And just a reminder that this webinar is going to be recorded, and we'll send you a copy of the recording in your email. So you can always view it later if you have to get up and leave partway through, or you want a refresher on some of the things that we're talking about. Okay, so we're just going to start and talk a little bit about Mirrix Looms. Mirrix Looms is a loom company that was started, gosh, almost 19 years ago by my mom, Mirrix's CEO, Claudia Chase. Now, at the time, she was she still is, but she was a tapestry weaver. And she was looking for a high-quality portable loom, so she could do things like take looms to my soccer games, my gymnastic meets, things like that. And so she designed one, and she had a friend build it for her. And eventually, it turned into a company. She realized with the help of a friend who was a beader that it could also be a fantastic bead loom. Then we started experimenting with combining beads and fiber, and it's turned into the versatile loom that it is today, and a great little family company. I've been working at Mirrix full-time since 2010, I think, so quite a long time. When Claudia started the company, we were living in Wisconsin, and that is where our manufacturing facility still lives today. Mirrix looms are made in America, but not only that, they're made in an amazing facility called Sunshine House. You can see the picture on the screen. In the center there is Sandy, and she is our Mirrix everything expert at Sunshine House. She make sure your looms get out on time. She's incredible. And some of the other people around her are some of the people that make your looms. Now, what Sunshine House does is it provides supported employment for physically and mentally disabled residents of Door County, Wisconsin. So it's just a really incredible place, and you know that your looms are made with a lot of love and a lot of care, and just a really wonderful place. So we just wanted to let you know or remind you about that and about Sunshine House and a little bit about Mirrix's origins. Okay, so let's get started on the real stuff. So first, one of the questions that I get asked a lot is, why buy a Mirrix loom for bead weaving? A Mirrix tends to be more expensive than other looms. I mean, you can go out and get a little bead weaving loom for $15, for $20. So why spend the money on a Mirrix? I could probably go on for an hour just talking about this, partly because that's what my job is. But I just made a few little bullet points to answer this question. The first answer to that is tension. Now, on any loom, tension is really important, even tension or tight tension. And because of the warping methods of a Mirrix and because our looms are so strong, it's really easy to get good tension. Now, one of the questions I'm going to answer later in this webinar is about how much tension you really need for bead weaving. So we'll kind of get back to that later. But the even tension from continuous warping on a Mirrix is really important, and it really helps you to make a quality bead piece every time. The next bullet point are size options. We have 8 different sizes of Mirrix looms, ranging from the 5-inch mini Mirrix, which is 5 inches wide. You can make a piece 2.5 inches wide on it, to the 38-inch Zeus loom, which is 38 inches wide. So if you want to make more than a small bracelet on a Mirrix, we have many different sizes to suit your needs. It's also really helpful to be able to make more than one piece. You could take something like our 16-inch Big Sister loom and warp a couple different, thinner pieces on that and have a bunch of projects going at once. So the size options are really important, and it means that you can buy a Mirrix loom and that could be your only loom, the last loom that you need to buy. Although a lot of our customers still, they need one for travel and they need a bigger one and a smaller one, and that's awesome too. But you can really, you can make a small piece on a larger loom, but you can also make a large piece, and that flexibility is really important to people. Another thing is our looms are vertical. Now, most bead looms are horizontal, not all, but most. And a vertical loom is really helpful for some people because it's easier on your back, it's easier to weave without hunching over for some people. But you can also lean your loom, against a pillow or lean it on a table or something and weave horizontally. So you have some options there. All of our looms bigger than the 5-inch mini Mirrix have little legs that fold out, so you can stand your loom up, and that's how they're vertical. I find weaving beads on a vertical loom to be much easier than on a horizontal one. So portable is the next one. Now you may say most bead looms are portable, but what's great about a Mirrix is because of the way they're designed, because they're vertical, and because of the really great tension, you can really move your bead loom around with a piece on it. A lot of the horizontal looms, it's harder to take that places. With a Mirrix, you can pretty much just stick your needle into your piece and throw it in a bag, and your piece will probably be fine. The things that I do to my poor looms, throwing them around, and I don't think I've ever had a problem with a piece breaking. So you really can use a Mirrix as a loom that you bring to workshops, that you bring to your friends' houses, that you travel with, and that's an important thing to be able to do that. The next one is strength. Mirrix looms are made out of aluminum and copper mostly, and we use very high quality materials that are mostly sourced from really very close to where our manufacturing facility is a Mirrix loom was built and designed to last a lifetime. It shouldn't break. If you should be able to pass your loom down to your children and your grandchildren. So again, you only need to buy one loom thing. Strength is very important. And the strength of the loom also helps with attention. Versatility. This is a really big one to me. As I mentioned before, the Merrick loom was originally designed as a tapestry loom. And you can also do bead weaving in the traditional method. You can do bead weaving with the shedding device, which is so cool. You can use a no warp ends kit. You can combine beads and fiber. You can weave wire. You can weave with leather. We have customers who've woven with paper, with found objects, inkle weaving. Just the possibilities really are endless. You can do a lot on a Merrick loom. And it's nice to know that you can buy one loom and do so many things on it. It's not just for bead weaving. The next one is community. Now, one of our goals at Mirrix is to provide events like this webinar where we can get our community together. We can, this is kind of broadly talking about the loom, but teach projects, get people together, doing things like we have a weave along coming up, which is kind of a community-based project where we'll be teaching you how to make a split loom necklace. And so you're going to get an email every Sunday, and a whole bunch of people will be doing the same project together. And then you can go on places like Ravelry or our Facebook group. If you're on Facebook, I really recommend joining this group. It's a bunch of amazing people. And if you have questions, if you want to crowdsource answers, or if you just need a little bit of inspiration, it's a great place to go. And it's also a great place to go talk about things like a weave along. If you have a question, or you're wondering what other people's pieces are looking like, it's a great place to go and share. So we really hope that we have created and continue to create a community of weavers. So it's more than just buying a product when you buy a Merrick loom. It's entering this community of like-minded people who are creative and who want to do these fun things. And we hope we can keep providing exciting projects and tutorials and things for you to do to keep you interested and keep you having fun. Merrick looms are made in America, as we mentioned, at the wonderful Sunshine House. And then also, this goes back to versatility, but we have things on our looms like the shedding device and the no warp ends kit. And those really make it unique. And those are things that you can add on. We have a lot of accessories that we'll talk about to enhance your bead weaving and to make things easier, or to make it so you can kind of do different pieces. So those are just a couple reasons. I hope the rest of the webinar, if you don't have a Mirrix, will give you some more reasons why you might want to invest and join our community. So here I just have a couple of examples of pieces that we've made. These are mostly projects, kits and things that can be made on a Mirrix that I'm just going to talk about. One thing that I left out, which I think is really important, is large beaded pieces, which a lot of our customers do. We had a blog post recently by a customer named Donna, who was absolutely amazing. And if you go back on the blog and look for that, it features some of her really large bead woven pieces. And they're just absolutely incredible, just gorgeous. And you can do that on a Mirrix because you have that size and you have the tension. So some of these projects, the checkerboard bracelet in the top is actually done with a no warp ends kit. So it's a really basic, pretty easy bracelet to do. And because we use the no warp ends kit, which basically allows you not to have to finish in your warp ends, they'll end up in little loops, and I'll talk about this later. But the finishing on this piece is really easy. So you can whip out a piece like this very fast on a Mirrix. The one in the middle is a wrap bracelet done with different sizes of beads and crystals and things on hand-painted silk. And this is another project that is just, it's fun to do. It's easy. The finishing is really easy. So that's a neat project. The Changing Seasons bracelet is a project on wire, on soft flex warp with beads, again done with a no warp ends kit. which was another really fun, easy, fast project to do. Then we have our a beaded phone case, which I actually have. I think I have, maybe I just have one of them. But it is amazing how well it holds up, because I used it for years and threw it in my purse and did all sorts of things, and it didn't get ruined. But now my phone is too big for it, so we're actually redesigning this project. Then there's a bracelet that's on a cuff. We have over on the right the tapestry bead cuff bracelet, which is our most famous project where you combine beads and fiber. At the bottom we have a leather wrap bracelet. So this is a wrap bracelet done on leather. Again, super easy to do on a Mirrix loom. So those are just a couple of examples. If you go to our website and go to the Your Work gallery, you can see more examples of projects that other people have done. And if you go to our site under free projects, there are a bunch of free projects there too. So those are just a couple examples. Now let's kind of get a little more into it. So first we're going to talk about warping and weaving without the shedding device. Now this is what people would call the traditional way of weaving beads. It's incredibly easy. It's just taking your beads, putting them on a warp thread, putting them on a thread, placing them behind your warp threads, and then sewing back through. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about warping and weaving in these different manners, but if you go to our YouTube channel or the videos section of our website, we have some really, really detailed videos showing you how to warp and how to weave. And like the warping video for bead weaving is incredibly long. I don't remember exactly how long it is, but it really goes over every detail you could possibly need to know. And for people who are visual learners, it's a great way to learn to warp. We also have warping PDFs on the website that have pictures step by step on how to do the warping and the weaving, or the warping in the different ways. So if you're worried about warping, if you're scared, don't be. It's a lot easier than you think. And it's fun and something that once you've done a couple of times, you'll really understand. So I'm just going to go over kind of the basics of warping without the shedding device. Now, in the top left, you have a picture that's an 8-inch Landy loom. And you see the wooden clips that are backwards on the loom. And they are holding the warping bar, which is that little aluminum bar. So basically, you take your clips, you put them backwards, and you press them together to hold that little aluminum bar. And what that bar does is, first, it gives you a place to tie your warp threads onto, because otherwise you'd have to tie onto one of the beams or something like that. But it also allows you to move your piece around the loom. This is called advancing your weaving, and this is actually something we're going to talk about later. But basically, once you've woven up the front of your loom, you can move that, loosen your tension and move that bar, and you can make more room on the front of your loom to weave a longer piece. So those are the two reasons that the warping bar is really helpful. Now, the basics of warping is that you're just doing a figure 8 around your loom. So you tie into your warping bar, and you can see in this middle picture. Then you take your warp thread and you go down from the back under the loom, and then right under and up, back up the front of the loom. Now, when you get to the top of the front of the loom, you're going to place your warp threads in a dent, which is a space in that spring at the top of the loom. Now, to choose which spring to put at the top of the loom depends on which beads you're using. And the way to determine that is to take the beads you're using. So let's say you're using 11 OC beads, put them on a needle and count how many are in an inch. So with 11 OC beads, you'll find about 15 in an inch. Now subtract 1, and this kind of can be a little loose, but like subtract 1 from that number so you get 14, and that's the coil, the 14 dent coil that you'd want to use with those beads. To figure out which coil is which, you put the coil on the loom and then measure an inch and count how many dents, those spaces, are in an inch. So basically what that does is it helps to space your warp threads for the different beads that you're using. And that is how you figure it out. So you go through a dent back around the looms. You can see you've basically just wrapped around the loom at this point. And then the only thing you need to remember is every time you hit that warping bar, you're just going to loop around the warping bar and come back from where you came. So you're basically just doing a figure eight. You wrap around the loom, you hit the warping bar, then you come back from where you came, wrap around the loom, hit the warping bar again from the other side, do a wrap around that, come back around, and just keep doing that. Keep figure eighting around the loom. So once you understand that, and again, watching the video and watching someone do it makes it really clear. Once you understand that pattern, that's it. I mean, it's very easy, and that's the same way that you work for tapestry, and it's the same way you work for bead weaving with the shedding device, except instead of putting one warp thread in each dent, you're going to put two. So it's easier than you think, I guess is what I'm trying to say, and definitely check out those videos. So the thing to remember is you're wrapping around the loom, and then every time you hit that warping bar, you change direction, wrap around the warping bar, change direction, and come back the way you came. So that's it. Warping is so easy. Now, weaving beads, I kind of spoke about this and how easy it is earlier, but I'm going to play you a little 2-minute video of Claudia weaving beads in the traditional method without the shedding device on the loom. So here you go.
The first thing I want to do is I want to thread my needle. I'm using a tulip beading needle here. I love these needles. I'm putting about 4 feet of thread on my needle and pour out some beads. Now remember, you have 1 less bead than warp threads. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 warp threads. I'm going to pick up 12 beads. Next, I'm going to place my beads in between and behind the warp threads. Next, I'm going to pull the thread through. And I'm going to sew through the top of the beads, and I'm going to sew on top of the warp, because the thread that holds the beads is behind the warp thread. And so now when I sew through the top, I have sandwiched my beads onto the warp threads. It's that simple.
So there you go. You can see how easy that is to weave beads. I mean, that's all there is to it when you're weaving this way. So that's the easy one. Now there is warping and weaving with the shedding device. Now I know that a lot of people don't understand what the shedding device is. I made a little video of me changing the shed in the shedding device that I will play for a second. But basically what the shedding device is it's that copper bar that reaches across your loom. And you have heddles, which are these little loops that you can either make yourself or you can buy. And those loops connect your warp threads to your shedding device, so to that copper piece that goes across the loom. And when you attach those heddles to different warp threads, and then you move the position, change the position of the shedding device, you actually lift up half of your warp threads. Now, for bead weaving, when you do this, you're actually then going to just place your beads on a thread into those warp threads. So each of the warp threads kind of sandwiches in between each bead. So you're actually weaving in. Instead of sewing through, you're weaving in the beads. So I'm just gonna play this video of me changing the shed so you can kind of see what that's like. So you can see that that's what it's like to change the shed, and that's how easy it is. So between each of those times changing the shed, you would be placing your beads in between those warp threads. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about warping with the shedding device. Now, warping with the shedding device is a little bit harder than warping without the shedding device for two reasons. One is because instead of putting one warp thread in each dent, in each space in that spring, you're going to do two. So you have to remember to do that. It's easy if you're not paying attention when you're warping to, even if you are paying attention, to put, to miss a dent or not put two in each dent. The good thing is you can always go and fix that problem before you tie off on your warp. So you have to remember to do that. You have to do that correctly. One of the things I always say when I'm teaching somebody to warp is, first of all, warp in a distraction-free environment. Because if you're trying to watch TV or have a conversation, or if you get up and do something different in the middle of warping, those are the times that allow you to make mistakes. And you don't want to make a mistake when you're warping. It's really best if you do it perfectly the first time, and then you don't have to worry about fixing any mistakes. And that's pretty obvious, but it really is important. So here I have a picture of the shedding device, and I have a picture of the loom in different sheds. And then at the bottom, this is a picture of the heddles on connecting the shedding device to warp threads. Now, this is the other thing that makes warping with the shedding device a little bit more difficult, because once you warp, you have to put the heddles, attach the heddles to the shedding device. And basically all this is wrapping a heddle around a warp thread and then attaching it to that little metal bar on the shedding device, and then spinning the shedding device around and attaching your heddles to the other side. So one warp thread that's in each, so you have pairs of warp threads in each dent, right? You have two warp threads together. One of those warp threads will be attached to the top of the shedding device, and the other one will be attached to the bottom. So that allows those two warp threads to separate when you move into different sheds. So this is hard because with bead weaving, you're usually working on a very small scale. So it's easy to miss a warp thread or incorrectly put a heddle on. So basically, you just want to check a lot. You just want to make sure that you are putting your heddles on the correct warp threads. I would suggest, if you haven't used the shedding device before, warp a really thin piece. Warp a piece that's like 5 beads wide or something with a shedding device. And just understand, because you won't make, or it's harder to make a mistake when you're doing a really thin piece. So experiment, kind of figure out where you could make those mistakes. One of the things that's really important is when you're putting on your second set of heddles, you always need to bring your heddle and your warp thread to the right of the other warp thread so it doesn't get crossed. So just little things like that, kind of paying attention. But once you learn how to warp this way, once you've done it a couple of times, it's not hard. It's just a matter of paying attention. And once you get the hang of it, you'll be a pro. So just be patient with yourself. Take your time. Don't rush. Make sure things are even. Make sure that your heddles are on correctly, that you didn't miss a warp thread. And you'll be successful. So it's not as scary as it seems. I know when you're dealing with all those little threads and those little heddles, it can seem scary, but it's not. Start small, and then you get to weave with the shedding device, which is really, really, really fun. And again, I recommend watching our warping video, because my explanation is not nearly as good as watching somebody put heddles on the loom. So watch that video and then watch the weaving video for bead weaving. And you can see how fun it is to weave in your beads. And it's also, you know, again, it takes some time, but it's faster to weave beads that way with the shedding device. So, you know, setup's going to take a little more time, but weaving will be faster. And I also think it's more fun. So here are a couple pictures of weaving. Now, I think it's hard to picture before you've done it exactly what's happening. But basically, you have your beads and they're on a thread, and you've lifted up half of your warp threads. You place those beads, as you can see here, kind of in that V between the lifted warp threads and the other warp threads. And when you change the shed, you're sandwiching those warp threads around the thread that's between the beads. So all of those beads are being sandwiched right in there. Now, for a piece that's as thin as this one in the picture, it's really easy to get all the beads in one place. For a wider piece, you're going to want to place them down in sections, which is another thing that I am going to address a little bit later. So basically, weaving with the shedding device is something I definitely recommend you all try. Our 5-inch loom doesn't come with a shedding device, and our 8-inch and 12-inch you can get with or without one. If you get it without, though, you can always buy one in the future. So if you start with an 8-inch without the shedding device and decide someday that you want to try weaving with the shedding device, you can always add one on for not much more than if you had just bought them together. So yeah, it's something I recommend. Make a small piece with the shedding device. Just try it out and have fun. I think you'll really like it. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the no warp ends kit. Now this is such a great kit. I love weaving with this. It's great for things like bracelets, where you don't want to deal with finishing off the ends. Now basically what it is it's cord that connects two thin bars, as you can see in this picture, with S hooks on them. And the way you warp is just by tying onto an S hook and then zigzagging and then tying onto the last S hook. And then you weave in the traditional method. And what happens when you finish your piece is, and you can see at the end, the last piece, I have that checkerboard bracelet on the S hooks. You can see that the S hooks make these little loops, right? And when you take the piece off the loom, the piece is going to expand a little bit, and those loops are just going to loop onto the end of the beads. So instead of having warp threads that you have to deal with finishing, and we're going to talk a little bit about finishing in a little while, but instead of having to deal with those warp threads and sewing them back in or tying knots, you don't have to do anything. You just have two warp threads, one on each side, that you have to do something with. So it makes it much easier to finish. I mean, finishing is just so easy with this and pretty. So this is definitely something I recommend playing with, especially if you're doing something like, let's say you want to make some presents for friends and you want to make 5 bracelets that are all pretty similar. You can keep the no warp ends kit set up in the same size, and you can warp, make a piece, take it off the loom, and then have that kit still in the same place. Warp again, take that one off. So it's really fast to do, and you can whip out a lot of smaller pieces. So that's no warp ends kit. If you got an older no warp ends kit, it came with paper clips probably, which you can also use. I like the S hooks because they're a little sturdier. Sometimes the paper clips kind of bend a little bit. but you can do it either way. So that's really fun and really, really easy. I mean, that is definitely the easiest way to warp. So that's that. I don't think we have a video on the No Warp Ends kit, at least not a new video, but we have some really detailed instructions on the PDF section of the website. So definitely check that out. Okay, so now we're going to talk about bead weaving accessories. Now we have a couple, we have more than this, but these are sort of our most popular ones. The No Warp Ends kit that I just talked to you about. And then the bottom spring kit. This is probably our most popular accessory. And it is, some people use it for tapestry, but most people who use it for bead weaving. What it is you basically are putting the tray and the spring that you have at the top of the loom, you're putting one on the bottom of your loom. Now this is incredibly helpful when you're using your shedding device because it helps you keep those pairs of warp threads separated. And it's also really helpful, especially when you're doing wider bead weaving without the shedding device, bead pieces without the shedding device. So I would say if you're using the shedding device, you should probably think about getting one. And if you're doing wide pieces, then I would think about getting one. It just helps with the warping process. It helps keeps things organized, which is important. And a lot of people really, really like this kit. Then we have our loom extenders. Now these are really fun. What they do is for the 12-inch and 16-inch loom, they add about 2 feet of weaving length to your piece. So if you're interested in weaving beaded belts or guitar straps, really long pieces, this allows you to do that without having to, sew more than one piece together. We can also get loom extenders for the 22-inch loom, but that only gives you an extra 20 inches of weaving length because the loom might be unstable if they were longer than that. So those are really fun if you're interested in that. I know a lot of people use them to weave belts, which is really fun. So then we have the add-on bottom beam. Basically what this is it's an extra bottom beam that you clamp onto your loom, and it separates your warp threads more. So it's easier to get your hand behind your warp threads when you're weaving beads, which, especially if people are weaving really wide pieces, can be very helpful. So that's a fun accessory that I feel like not too many people know about. Then we have our extra warping bar kit. And what this does is it allows you to warp your loom with 2 warping bars instead of 1. And that will make it, number 1, so again, so you can get your hand behind your piece because then you only have 1 layer of warp, but also it helps you save warp. So let's say you have a 16-inch loom, which can make a piece 34 inches long. But you only want to make a piece 5 inches long. If you add this extra warping bar on, you're going to use a lot less warp thread. So that's another fun kit. You can look through the accessories section of our site to see kind of some more kits, but these are definitely our most popular. Okay, oh, this is taking so long. Okay, have to go faster now. So then I just wanted to talk briefly about combining beads and fiber. This is, if you're into bead weaving and you've thought about weaving with fiber, maybe you knit, maybe you're just a little bit curious, combining beads and fiber is really, really fun. We have 2 projects, I think, just 2. Maybe, we also did like a little beaded cell phone case. But these 2 projects, one of these is, the one on the left is a dog collar made with size 11 beads and silk, which is so cute. And the other one is our famous tapestry bead cuff bracelet with 11 O beads. And this one has different embroidery thread, silk, kind of novelty yarns. You can sort of experiment with your yarn. Now, the most important thing to do when combining beads and fiber is making sure that you have the right combination of beads and fiber and the right set, so the right coil. For 8 O beads, a 10 dent coil is good. For 11 O beads, a 14 dent coil works. And then you just want to make sure that you're using the right fiber. So let's say you have your loom set for the 8/0 beads for like the tapestry bead cuff bracelet. So you're using a tendon coil. If you're using a really, really thin yarn, you may be able to see the warp threads through that. Or if you're using a really, really thick yarn, you may also have problems. So you want to kind of experiment with what yarn works with the warp coil that you're using. One way to figure this out, there isn't, like with bead weaving, there is a way to figure out the exact warp coil. With fiber, it's a little more difficult. One way is to warp your loom with whatever the set that you have and take your fiber and put it between two warp threads sitting next to each other. And if that fiber is way thinner than those two warp threads, it's probably too thin. And if it's thicker, then it's probably too thick. So that's kind of a good way to judge. But experiment. I mean, I've been seeing some of the tapestry bead cuff bracelets, and we've done a lot of experimenting with this. You could do things like, you know, add crazy railroad yarn and put different yarns together in different colors. You can actually start doing tapestry techniques. But you can sort of see if something is too thick or too thin, you'll be able to tell. So it's a matter of experimentation, as much of weaving is, but it's definitely something that you should try out if you are a bead weaver, because I think you'll really enjoy it and start to get a taste for tapestry. And why not? Because your loom can do it. And also this, I think it's easier, like with the 8/0 beads, with the tapestry bead cuff bracelet. I usually use the shedding device, but you can also do it without the shedding device. So you don't necessarily need the shedding device to combine beads and fiber. And actually with the 11/0 beads, like the dog collar project doesn't even use the shedding device. I don't even think it can because the beads are so small. But anyway, check out those projects and think about maybe experimenting. Okay, so now we're gonna go to the fun part. These are questions for you, from you, not for you, from you. So again, I just kind of grouped some questions together. I know some of you also ask these questions and your name might not be on there, but I was just trying to go through and group correctly. So sorry if I missed you. Okay, so Kathy, Carol, and Sherry asked, what type of thread should you use when weaving beads? Now, the answer is that most beading thread will work. If you go to your local bead store and ask about beading threads, I'm sure they'll help you. Or if you go online, you know, most things that you use for off-loom stitches will work. We really like Ceylon D because it's really strong, which is very, very important when you're talking about thread and especially warp. And it doesn't fray very easily, which is also important because it's a pain when you cut your thread and it's frayed and you're trying to put it on your needle and it's a pain. So we really like Ceylon D. But experiment, figure out kind of what you like because everybody has different opinions. Now, if you're using the shedding device, the only thing I will say is we don't recommend using Fireline. That's because, first of all, it's expensive and you use a lot of thread when you're warping with the shedding device. But it's thick and it doesn't allow the rows to lie next to each other well. So we've had some trouble using that with the shedding device. So I wouldn't recommend that. But otherwise, Ceylon D is our favorite, but experiment. See what other threads you might like. All right, next question. So Isabel, Leslie, Carolyn, and Kathy asked, how do you know what the correct amount of tension is when weaving beads? Now, I talked about this a little bit before. Now, it's a hard question to answer if you're not standing there in front of a loom with somebody because it's hard to measure, you know, it's hard to measure tension. You want your thread to be taut. You don't want to be stretching or breaking your warp threads, but you want it to be kind of, you know, if you move, you can see this picture here, if you move your finger across your warp threads, you want them to be taut. You don't want any looseness there. And the reason is because it's easy to miss beads if your threads aren't tight enough. And I find that that's the biggest problem when people are having problems missing beads, or they're finding that their tension seems uneven. It's because your tension isn't tight enough. And I think people naturally don't want to make their tension too tight because they're worried they're gonna break their warp threads, or it just doesn't quite seem natural. So usually you could use a little bit more tension if you're having a problem like that. The same goes for weaving with the shedding device. It's actually easier to tell if your tension is too loose when you're using the shedding device, because if you have threads that are too loose, you won't even be able to get a shed. Like, you won't even be able to see that space where you put your bead threads. I mean, where you put your beads. So yeah, the other thing to remember is that you can adjust your tension anytime. So, which is another thing that's unique to the Mirrix world, maybe not unique to the Mirrix loom, but that is a great feature of the Mirrix loom, is that if you feel partway through your project that your threads aren't tight enough, you can just tighten them up a little bit. And you can experiment a little bit. You know, is it easier for you to weave if they're a little bit looser, a little bit tighter? Play around with that. And eventually, after some practice, you'll start to see what the correct tension for you is. So that's the answer. I know it's not the best answer in the world because I can't give you a solid, this is what you should do. But I hope that helps some. All right. Linda, okay, so this is a big question. So Linda asks, how do you judge how tall to set your loom prior to warping? And then Becky asks, kind of on the same front, how do you estimate how much warp is needed? This is an important question. For me, what I tend to do is just totally overestimate. So if I need, you know, I try to care less about wasting warp threads, and I err on the side of being careful and making sure that I have enough thread and enough room on my loom to finish my piece off. So the first thing that you want to do, I'm going to kind of give you some guidelines, and this really depends on a bunch of different factors. But the first thing you want to do is note the length of your loom. If you go into our comparison charts on our website, which is on a drop-down menu, you can see how tall each loom and how short each loom goes. So note the length of your loom, note the length and the width of the piece that you're weaving, figure out which warp coil you're going to use, and then figure out which way you're warping. So for the no warp ends kit or the extra warping bar kit, you're pretty much just weaving on the front of the loom, warping on the front of the loom and weaving on the front of the loom. So it's a lot easier to calculate how much height you need, because that'll be pretty much what you see on the front of the loom. But warping with the shedding device or without the shedding device in the regular manner, you want to make sure that you're leaving some warped waste, we call it. Without the shedding device, we'd say like 8 to 10 inches of warp waste, and with 16 to 18 inches of warp waste. And basically what this is extra warp that you can use for finishing. So extra warp so you have room to tie knots or to weave your ends back in. And it's important that you make sure you have enough because if you don't, then it's really difficult to finish the piece. Now, this said, there are different ways you can finish and not have to deal with that. Like, for example, there's this little picture right here, which is a piece that Claudia did. And instead of tying off knots, this is actually a pretty wide piece. What she did was she wove a header. So she actually wove just thread in. And then she took some E6000 glue and glued above that header and let it dry. And then when she takes it off the loom, she's actually just going to fold that behind the piece and back it or mat it or however she's going to finish that. So there are ways where you could get some more length out of your loom. But generally speaking, you want to leave some warp waste to tie off your ends. Okay, so I'm just going to give you an example of a piece and how I would calculate both how much thread I need and how tall I want to make my loom. It should be noted that I'm going to do one without the shedding device. With the shedding device, you have, because you have the shedding device there, you have a little less weaving room on the front of your loom. And that's why you need to leave a little bit extra space there. Without the shedding device, you have more room on the front to weave up. So here's my example. I want to make a piece 20 inches long and 5 inches wide on my 8-inch Laney loom, which can make a piece 5 inches by 24 inches. So it's almost the maximum. And I'm going to be using 11 OC beads, so I'm going to use the 14 dent coil, and I'm not using the shedding device. Now, so it's 20 inches of length, and I need, I want to leave myself at least, about 8 to 10 inches of work waste. So let's say I need to measure for like 30 inches around the loom. So I'm going to set my loom to be like 15 inches tall. So on the front and the back, I have about 30 inches, right? So that will allow me for the work waste I need, and when I'm advancing my piece around the loom, I will have enough room to make that piece 20 inches tall. But personally, I think I would be a little more comfortable weaving with the loom a little bit higher. So weaving with the loom at about 16 inches tall, just to be safe, because I like to be more safe than sorry, right? And then to calculate so once you've figured out how tall you're going to set your loom, to calculate how much work thread you need is fairly easy. So you have 14 threads in an inch because you're using your 14 dent coil. So multiply that by 5, you have 70 total threads. And then you're going to measure the length completely around the loom, so all the way around. And then you're going to multiply that by 70. And that's about how many yards you're going to need for your work. So that's kind of basic. It's not going to be absolutely perfect, perhaps, but that's kind of basically how to figure that out. So I guess my big tips for deciding where to set your loom is to play around with it. Do some measurements. Set your loom to 15 inches and take a measuring tape and measure around and figure out how much work waste you'll have, and decide if that's enough, if you want to set your loom a little bit taller. And also think about how you're finishing your piece and what method you're using. If you're using the shedding device, no warp-ins kit, all that. So again, it's not a perfect answer, but once you start weaving, you'll start to understand, and it'll be easier to figure out kind of what you want. I've pretty much gotten to a point where I feel like I just know, it's easy to eyeball how tall I'm going to need my loom. And yeah, but better to measure and know what you're doing. So that was a great question, guys. Thank you for that. Okay, so Sylvia asked, how do you deal with a narrow warp on a wider loom? This is a great question. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, if you have a 16-inch loom, you could weave a really thin piece on that 16-inch loom. Just because it's big doesn't mean you can't make a smaller piece on it. But if you're weaving a thin piece on a smaller loom, you have a problem of the warping bar. So that bar in the back of the loom, that little metal bar, of being unstable. So like, let's say, see that piece on the right, the bigger piece with the purple ribbon. If that piece had been woven in the middle of the loom, the warping bar on either side, because there's a lot of space where there's no warp threads, would wiggle a little bit. It wouldn't be stable. So if you're going to do a narrow piece, I recommend either doing what we did in that picture, where you have a piece on one side of the loom, and on the other side, you just wrap a ribbon around, or another thread or something like that. Make sure it's wrapped around the warping bar and tie that, and that will just balance your warping bar for you. So that's the easiest way. That's what I normally do. Another way would just be to warp 2 pieces. So warp one on one side, warp one on the other side. That will balance your warping bar. And you'll only have to warp once, and you'll make 2 pieces. But sometimes that's not a good idea if you're impatient and want to weave one and get it off your loom. Another way, and this was another one of those times, our customers teach us so much, that a customer mentioned this way, and I'd never even thought about it before, and it turns out a bunch of people are doing this. If you're not using the shedding device, you can actually just keep your warping bar in your clips as you weave. So you can see the picture here. You can see how at the top of that pink picture, the warping bar is unstable because there was a very thin piece on one side of the loom. It would have been the same if it was in the center. And so I just moved my clips and it's holding up the warping bar like that and keeping it stable. So if you're not using the shedding device, that's a great way to balance your piece. So that is the answer to that one. Okay, Connie asks, how do you replace a broken heddle? Yes, this is a place I have been. Although your heddles, especially like if you buy pre-made heddles from us, they shouldn't break. They're really, really strong and they're reusable. But sometimes you cut them, they come on a roll and you have to cut them out. Sometimes you cut it too close or you make your own heddles and you don't tie a good knot. You know, there are reasons that they break sometimes. So one solution would be, depending on how wide your piece is you could go back and take out all the other heddles and re-put them on. And if the heddle is at the very edge of your piece, then that might be the way you want to do it. But what you can do is just put your shedding device in the neutral position, so not in either shed, and take a thread and just tie to the shedding device, to the bar in the shedding device, and to your warp thread, and make sure that it's not pulling on the warp thread. So make sure it's you know, spacing correctly like the other heddles are doing. But that's a good way to fix it without having to go back and actually replace the heddle, is just to tie on like that. And yes, as I said, it is something I have had to do before, and it works. You know, you just really need to make sure that when the shedding device is in neutral, it's not pulling up too much on your warp threads, because you need that spacing to be right. So, so the warp thread is being pulled up the same way as all the other ones. Okay. All right, so this is a big one. Patricia and Robin asked, how do you weave with different sizes of beads? In fact, we had a lot of people ask this question. So the answer is math. The answer is that you want to figure out how many of one bead equal the size of another bead. So if you're weaving with different size beads across, so let's say you want one row of 11O beads, and then on top of that you want one row of crystals, but the size of the 11O beads and the size of the crystals are different. So what you do is figure out, and I don't know if this is right, but let's say that 4 of your 11O beads equal the width of one of your crystals. And so what you would do is warp your loom for the crystals, so to fit the crystals in there. And then when you're putting your row of your 11O beads, you'd put 4 between each warp thread. And then when you go up and do your crystals, you just put 1 crystal there. So it's a matter of figuring out which beads equal the size of another bead. And you can do things, you know, there are a lot of different fun ways you can do this. Like, for example, let's say somebody had a question today about, you know, what if you want to put one large bead in the middle of a piece somewhere? So what you would do then is you would warp across. So let's say, again, you're using 11O beads. You warp with your 14-dent coil, you know, warp, warp, warp. And then in the middle, you figure out that you know, crystal, let's say, that you want to put in just that middle row in one place, you make sure that the spacing will equal the size of that crystal just in that one row. So you'd basically be warping one dent, one dent, one dent, one dent, and then maybe you'd skip and have 4 dents that you'd skip in the middle, and then go 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. So you have in the middle of the piece one larger hole. And then the other thing you can do, and then you would go and weave with beads, 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 and then in that one place where you want to put that bigger crystal, you'd put that crystal. Another thing you might want to do, and I just did a video that's on our YouTube channel about this with the piece that you see here, which is you might want to have some rows of different size beads going up, and then weaving another next to that where they're all the same size. And here it's pretty much just a matter of, again, figuring out how many beads equal the height of one bead, but also figuring out how you want to deal with the holes. So like I'm using like 2-hole beads here, And in some places, I'm going through all the beads, and then I'm going through that one hole there. So kind of figuring, you know, it's math, and it's figuring out what works with beads that you're using and the holes that you have. But check out that video that I made, because that talks about that more in detail. And we also have some projects that incorporate different size beads that are free on the website that you might want to check out. Oh, it's already been an hour. Okay, I'll keep going really fast. Linda asks, how do you advance your warp? So this is something we kind of talked about before. When you're done weaving, you move your warping bar to the bottom back of the loom. And then once you've woven up, like this picture, as tall as you can weave on the front of your loom, you just loosen your tension and then take that warping bar and slowly start moving it up the back of the loom. And this will rotate your piece around the back of the loom, so you have more places to weave on the front. But one thing that I heard lately, there was a rumor going around that you couldn't advance your weaving if you're using a bottom spring kit. You can. All you have to do is just remove the spring on the bottom spring kit before you do that. And at that point, you won't be needing that spring for the bottom spring kit because your warps are already organized because you started weaving. So you can do that. Anna asks, how do you fix a cut warp thread after you've woven? This is really hard. I would try not to cut your warp threads. It can be fixed. Basically, you have to release the tension on the loom and then splice in a new thread between the two broken ends by tying surgeon's knots, which you can look up what that is. The trick is really to get the tension on the broken warp thread the same as the rest of the warp threads. And that's why releasing the tension helps, because you can tie better knots. And then increase the tension again and hope that everything holds. And Tina asks, what's the trick to getting beads in the right place? Now, when you're weaving a wider piece, it's pretty much impossible to take all your beads with a shedding device or without the shedding device behind your loom or down your warp threads and get them all between the right the right warp threads. The way to deal with this is to do it in sections. So you can see this little diagram here. You're coming from the right to the left if you're weaving the traditional method. And let's say you just want to put in those first 5. So you put those in the correct space. You can pull out your thread and to kind of help you place those in there. And then just keep going like that, because those threads are going to stay. And as you'll come back, you'll weave through with your needle, and just keep going in those sections. And the same with the shedding device. So basically, weave in small sections, and it gives you more control over the process. Next, what are the best finishing techniques? There are a couple. One, we love, as I said, the no warp ends method. You can add clasps to your pieces. You can do things like weave a header and a footer, and then back your piece, or put your piece on a, like something like this piece here is on a cuff. So that's kind of backed like that. Another way is sewing in your ends. And we're going to talk a little bit about this in the weave along that's coming up. This is hard to do. And we try really hard to come up with ways to back our pieces or to add clasps or do something like that to not have to weave in our pieces. And just to be clear, I don't know if I was, a header and a footer is basically like what we're talking about on that other piece, where you weave in some just thread to kind of hold your beads in, and then you flip that piece over and then back that piece there. So those are some basic finishing techniques. Again, if you look at some of our projects, you can see some good examples of finishing. All right, and we're done. A little bit over an hour, but not too much. Thank you so much for listening to me for an hour and 5 minutes. I hope you enjoyed this and this helped you and you got some of your questions answered. If you have more questions, feel free to email me, elaine@mirrixlooms.com. I'll respond to you as soon as I can. And again, this will be recorded, so if you want to go back and reference anything I said, we will send that to you shortly. So thank you for watching.